The box art for Atari 2600 games were nothing short of masterfully illustrated, created by multiple different artists with different backgrounds, and giving a breath of life to games on the console that were essentially different colored blocks. The boxes for the 2600, along with multiple other consoles at the time, had to be enticing because what was actually seen in-game, while still somewhat impressive for the time, would not have made for ideal advertising. The same cannot be said for Nintendo, who were in the process of resuscitating the video game industry, specifically in the West, which was still going through the video game crash that started in 1983. While competent personal computers existed prior to the launch of the NES in 1985, like the Commodore 64, which could easily rival the NES in many aspects, no system or computer seemed too enthused about showing the actual gameplay as the packaging. Either because many games prior to the NES lacked a certain polish to the visuals, or most likely because many just didn't see the pixel art itself as a selling point to put on the box. But the geniuses at Nintendo knew that just seeing the games they made would be all the convincing necessary. This was the start of video games being able to portray their story, environment, and arguably the most crucial for Nintendo, their characters through the actual game. It wanted to show that the moment the player looked at the box. So while Warlords might look better hung up on the wall, Super Mario Bros. Represents something far greater, the next step in gaming technology. They rightfully boasted their superior visuals when compared to other home consoles at the time, the extra care put into the pixel art, and not only was it enticing, but it was exactly what the game was. What you saw is what you got, and what you got was mind-blowing at the time. The pixel art boxes, aka the black box NES games, were most prevalent during the system's first 2 years on the market. This was to be as upfront in their advertising as possible and gain both consumers and retailers' trust in the gaming industry back, as one of the repercussions of the crash was a distrust of what mediocre home console game might lie within the box. While Nintendo couldn't convey all of the gameplay that the player would experience on the box, they could get a huge head start by showing how much quality and care was put into just the visuals. There was a striking difference in pixel art quality that was really unmatched by anything except some personal computers, and most notably, the arcade. There was a seemingly untouchable goal that most consoles had at the time: bring the arcade quality to homes. Nintendo took this challenge on in full stride, so much so that Shigeru Miyamoto himself was impressed that his arcade game Donkey Kong was recreated on the system, even with the color palette limitations. The NES had a color palette containing 56 colors to work with, only restricting 25 colors usable on screen at once. Sprites were also limited to a roughly 8x8 pixel tile, some being combined to create larger sprites. And an overload of sprites on screen at once would bog the system down, which is why we experience that flickering on screen, which eases some of the system's stress. It was mind-bogglingly limited and primitive by today's standards, but it was freeing at that time, especially compared to the other consoles at that time. And pixel art was to be fully embraced by Nintendo, and in turn, recognized by everyone. Using pixel art on the cover was not only an honest depiction of their games, but it was also calling attention to a new form of art, one that was no longer something to vaguely convey characters or objects and environments. It was something pleasing and fun to look at. It was a unique form of art, exclusive to this artistic medium. Before the NES, the pixels on screen from home consoles were best complemented by the artist's rendering of the game on the box art. The rendering on the box was supposed to aid the player's imagination as they played, helping them interpret the blocky pixels on screen. The pixel art wasn't completely abstract though, you could get the basic gist of what certain things were, but there was still a reasonably big gap between the player and a certainty of what many things were. The NES shortened that gap by a ton, not filling it with an artist's rendering of the game, but with the pixel art itself. Its inclusion on the box didn't just instill a recognition of pixel art, but it helped revitalize a dying industry at the same time, by showing both honesty and quality simultaneously. This box art wasn't what was solely responsible for the return of the gaming market. In fact, it was one of the more minute things that attributed to the resuscitation of video games. Eventually, illustrated box art started making its way into the NES library, and this wasn't a bad thing or a step down by any means. We got great box art, iconic box art from the illustrated line of NES games, but there's no denying that the pixel art boxes were one of the small puzzle pieces, but a piece of the puzzle nonetheless, that helped Nintendo make their mark on the industry, showing their system's capability during the first 2 years on store shelves. I love the box art for the Atari, Intellivision, later NES games, and the Sega Genesis, even more so than the pixelated NES covers. It brought in an outside source and a unique depiction of the respective game the illustrators were working on. But when you see the pixelated NES covers, you're looking at a real representation of those games, a highly perceivable character or environment. Even though they didn't know how impactful it would really be, Nintendo was embracing a new form of art that would go on to inspire countless indie devs and digital artists later in the future. Millions of people's first impression of an NES game wasn't an illustrated depiction of the game, but an actual taste of it.